our videographer told us it's time to sit down and roll the tape. Apparently this was one of the most popular sessions on the APPAM side of the world. So I wonder if that means there are a few emptier seats because people can catch it on YouTube later. So this is very momentous, right? Because it's APPAM and NASPAA together. This is one of the few joint sessions, or as my kids would say, they're comic book fans, that it's Worlds Collide. So here we are, and in the spirit of Worlds Collide, David Swindle, my co-lead on this panel, and I realized, I don't know, maybe about 5-6 weeks ago, that we were running the same panel on really similar topics with similar configuration of individuals, and so we should merge, and we have. So that's why collaboration, right there. So that's why there's a number of us, but we are going to run a tight ship because we very much want to hear from you as well. And just to start off as to why we're here, this, in many ways, I'm thinking how this panel grew out of conversations that Angela and I had about 3 years ago when we had a session just like this at NASPAA, and it was really about what's the civic role that schools like ours play, that universities play, and that often when that conversation happens, it focuses on real estate, community, and economic development. And for us, capitalizing the P in public service education really meant policy. And so that was the conversation we wanted to have. And it was so interesting and so engaged and passionate that we started running the session every year at NASPAA. And then similar configuration here and with others in the audience like Mark Funkhauser, we started also having that conversation at ASPA and APPAM. And I'm really happy to say that I think the field is really starting to take shape and more definition since that conversation 3 years ago. And so today what we're going to do is take stock, look at the challenges that still persist, and then also begin to better clarify what this field looks like in terms of our schools having a real role and impact on policy making locally and nationally and internationally. So with that, I want to turn it over to my co-lead, David.
So we thought what we would do is, for purposes of organizing the formal portion of this, is to divide up presentations with regards to our challenges that we've seen working with local, state, and federal government officials from an academic perspective, the challenges that that raises, before then kind of transitioning to the perception from the other side, what are the challenges that practitioners have in dealing with academics, before then kind of evolving the discussion to one of the institutional barriers and incentives that we might be able to place in our educational institutions to encourage more of this applied research and outreach to working with practitioners. So what we'll do is I'll talk a little bit about my experiences at Arizona State University working with something called the Local Government Research Collaborative, and some of the challenges that's led to, some really great opportunities as well. Neil's going to then talk a little bit about what he's been doing working with local governments and the challenges that he's faced. Then we're going to go to Paul, who's going to talk a bit about some of the federal experiences on both sides of the equation. We'll go then to Carolyn and talk a little bit about her experiences working with local, state, and federal officials in terms of the challenges that she's run into and the opportunities as well. And then Angela, from her perspective, from the Congressional Research Service and her days there. Then we're going to shift to the institutional side. David's going to talk a bit about, from the kind of the dean's perspective, about incentive systems that that are barriers or incentives to engage in more of this kind of collaborative work with practitioners and outreach work with practitioners. Before Jenny's going to do a summary of the work that she's been doing with NSF with regards to some of the major findings that they've come across so far. So that's kind of the outline of what we'll be doing, about 5 minutes each. Then we're going to spend most of the time in a discussion with you all, and get some ideas on should we be doing this, if so how, and what might the benefits of doing so be. So I thought I would start with, and I'm sure everybody in here has probably read the Washington Post piece about a year ago that was not supportive of a lot of our policy programs, to say the least. There was an article in 2013 in State and Local Government Review by Jinfeng Wang, who's at Illinois Springfield, if I remember correctly. And the work that she was doing there was actually highlighting some of our journals and what our journals are focusing on. So what of our focus in academia is sometimes not necessarily what the practitioners are looking for. So that's part of the disconnect, is what we're doing is not necessarily what, in my experience, a lot of local officials are looking for us to do, even those of us who focus on local government issues. Now there have been certainly some rebuttals to that. David Moynihan had a good piece on the APPAM blog in response to the Washington Post op-ed. Governing Magazine did their survey of senior level state and local officials and how they evaluate their experiences getting graduate work in policy fields. And lo and behold, our customers, so to speak, our students, they kind of like what they got. They're pretty satisfied with that. But the screen itself from the Washington Post actually illustrates a concern that I've had for many years with regards to who is speaking to those in power. This is kind of the people who are funding our schools, who are giving gifts, who are making legislation at the federal, state, and local levels. And so a lot of that scree is aimed not at us. In fact, very few of us were actually involved in that conversation at all, but at other folks that we don't always do a great job interacting with ourselves. So it raises questions with regards to the fact that we have just amazing intellectual talent in higher education in the United States. I mean, it's a font of talent, and we're producing outstanding research, but we're doing so in journals that are hidden behind paywalls and are written in a jargon that's simply not particularly appealing to those that we would like to use the information that we're generating. The topics we pursue sometimes are generally not always in line with the needs and desires of those that we think we're serving. Our faculty are incredibly intellectually talented, but don't always have a great depth at working in government or in nonprofits, kind of the experiential side, which sometimes leads our students to discount some of our value, as well as those for whom we are training people to work. So we don't always come across as having we have great book smarts, but not necessarily the experiential side. We face an increasingly hostile legislative environment. The federal level obviously is represented by some of the cuts at NSF that are aimed particularly at political science as well as other social science areas, but also state legislatures with some significant disinvestments in higher education that we've seen, as well as attacks that are almost perennial now in some states on tenure, concept of tenure. So while our field produces a lot of excellent scholarship, some amazing achievements, we in academia are not really that great at celebrating those achievements in that research that we do. We don't get our message out. We're not good at PR. We're too busy trying to do good work, quite frankly. And so we've capped all this off with the evolution of a series of institutional incentives to disincentivize us to do this kind of work, this applied work, which gets kind of second-class status, maybe even third-class status, when it comes time for promotion and tenure discussions. We focus on top-tier journal peer-reviewed articles. That's the point of the realm. And that does not allow us necessarily the opportunity to do a lot of applied work. So my experience with the local government research collaborative was an idea that came from Bob O'Neill at ICMA to bring together those interested local governments that would like to have research specifically done on questions that they have. So each of them we had 21 volunteer local governments in Canada and the United States, put $5,000 in 2 consecutive years into a research pot that I helped manage. And this has been a real interesting learning experience because you have 21 very type A personalities that want certain things based on their perspectives, and that perspective is not monolithic. It would be a lot simpler if it was. But they had to develop trust with each other, and then they had to develop an appreciation for a research topic. The first research topic took us months to come up with, and the one they came up with was kind of milquetoast. It wasn't, they wanted big ideas, they just couldn't agree on what, first off, a big idea was, much less which big idea to pursue. And so they ended up with something that's kind of a low-key question. And then we had the sudden realization that they don't really understand research the way we understand research in academia. The gulf was much bigger on that question than I presumed it was. and even with my individual working with them. But as a group, it was very shocking that we were dealing with jargon issues, we're dealing with methodological issues, and that's created a frustration amongst them dealing with me as the manager who's trying to find actual actionable research that's going to help them make decisions. And even though we have that first project that's coming to fruition, they're having a hard time seeing exactly how it's going to help them. And so part of the research has actually been to try and highlight that connection. And it's been tough bridging that gulf. So I'm going to stop with that, and I'm going to turn it over to, let's see, who did I say was next? It's the cast of thousands. Yeah.
So it was good I go next. I want to give you an example, contrary to David's kind of characterization of faculty just focused on publications. So I'm going to try to tell this story quickly, succinctly, and make the key points. So this is one example of an area of research. Back in 2006, when I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Milwaukee Public Schools reached out to us because many of you are aware of No Child Left Behind, legislated in 2002. And one of the important consequences of No Child Left Behind for schools was that if, for those schools that weren't making adequate yearly progress for at least 3 years, they were required to implement interventions. And these interventions were to help those students in schools with supplemental educational instruction to help them make gains more rapidly in their educational achievement. So basically the law imposed these interventions without really much in the way of resources. It actually asked schools to redirect their resources to meet these accommodations. In 2006, Milwaukee Public Schools said, we need help with this. We're having to do this, and so we went there. They had a half-time person in their rec department trying to implement this program. And required schools to work with private market providers, schools that were not making equity progress, weren't assumed that they could deliver those interventions. And so there was this challenge of figuring out who was going to deliver those services, how they were going to be paid, and how and schools were supposed to eliminate providers if they weren't effective. But again, no resources there for evaluation. So we started there. 2 years after that, the Institute of Education Sciences, we applied for funding to encourage us. We expanded to 6 school districts, big school districts. When we started working with Chicago Public Schools, they had 25% of all kids in the nation who were required to have those interventions. We had the Los Angeles Unified School District, the Allison Penn School District, Minneapolis, and Austin. So we had big school districts. We had to build partnerships with these districts to work with them. They're incredibly challenged. They don't have, they don't have resources to impose intervention, much less engage with academics. So we had to convince them that we were going to add value, and we were going to deliver research to them that they could use. So first of all, we started with questions. Institute of Education Sciences provided $3 million in funding for us over 4 years to carry out this study. They have very high standards for rigorous methods that they expect to be used. But we also had to go into school districts and figure out what were their most pressing needs in implementing these interventions. So our first challenge was we had to identify who were the stakeholders, and they just weren't the school districts. There were the parents and the students, the providers who were delivering these services, the federal government, which is interested in, should this be a policy that should be continued, as well as the states. The states were kind of, the states actually had to approve the providers, and the districts had to figure out how to implement. They were kind of a middleman there. So our research had to be rigorous, in part because our funder, and because of the need, in order to figure out, how is this effective? We needed rigorous research methods. But we also had to be on the ground, because it's just as happens in a lot of policies, it's happening in many different ways in the school districts. The school districts each had their own challenges because of their own institutional and population context that they're working with, political challenges. So we'd be very sensitive to the politics in each of the district. And so we had what we created we called it Integrated Qualitative and Quantitative, or SES, Supplemental Education Services IQ squared. And so we integrated qualitative and quantitative. We're in the ground observing what's happening, interviewing the stakeholders, and also then using very large-scale data analysis to analyze impacts. We felt like that was really important. So another thing is common when you fund study or evaluation, at the end someone presents a report and here's our findings. That couldn't happen this way. Things were changing on the ground constantly in the policy context as well as for the school districts. So what we did was each year we committed, we went to each of the districts, we gave briefings on our findings. When we did that, we found out that, wow, we're seeing the same challenges in Chicago as in Dallas, and they're dealing with it in different ways. So we created cross-district webinars to engage the people from the districts to learn from each other as well. And they absolutely love these conversations. They could see, oh, here's a strategy that we can do too, and it's working here. And so we provided that information from our research. So we were constantly feeding the findings back with standards that we had to feel confident that they could and should be used. I could go on and on, but I won't tell you all the different ways the districts used it. Then we also created public webinars. And so our public webinars, we invited all the public, got the word out. I mean, we had people from Anchorage, Alaska, to Vermont, to Florida, to all over the country listening on the webinars. So we could also, then we had always in our webinars, opportunities for exchanges afterwards. We produced not just, so there are approximately 5 journal articles and 2 books that are coming out of this project altogether, but we also had policy briefs for the districts. We had briefs for the parents. We had information disseminated to principals that they could use in kind of managing the market. We actually had, so when we found out they were doing something in Chicago, Dallas wanted to do it, they couldn't do it. The state education agency put a barrier in there. We worked with the legislator. We created a bill that Governor Perry signed into law so that those districts could take advantage of that lever too. So I think the key was we were responsive. We were dealing with policy relevant questions. The findings got disseminated at the federal level to Office Management Budget who wanted to hear about it. It got disseminated to states, broadly across. Districts are using it. And from that project, what happened is NCLB, basically states were granted waivers, which they needed to do, so we continued to work with some of those districts as they've used the research that we've given to make changes. We've seen some amazing results. I just did an interview with Andy Feldman. He runs this thing which we talk about how things completely turned around Milwaukee, and now we actually have funding from a private donor to continue the work and look at the next challenges these districts are facing, how to use educational technology more effective. But again, on the ground, responsive, looking at the interventions they're implementing. And it has not been, for us, as I mentioned, it has not been, oh, well, we can't do policy briefs and do journal articles. We can do both. It takes commitment, resources, but it's possible. And so I just want to encourage that there are these kinds of opportunities out there. I think the more academics do that and engage, I mean, we also feel better about ourselves as academics because we feel like we really can see the impact that we're having in the districts and feel like we are doing a sense of public service as well as to our profession.
Caroline has been double booked, so she's going to be leaving a little before.
But yeah, I have a session that starts the same time this one ends, so I might be 5 minutes.
Okay, so a little bit early. So Neil, why don't you go ahead and talk, and then.
Great. So it's good to hear you focusing on the positive, Carolyn, because I wanted to a little bit as well, and then get to what I think of as a big challenge. So the positive for me, especially even in the last few years, is the number of these types of initiatives has blossomed, and the creativity is really tremendous. So I'm even thinking when you go west to east, there's a lot happening. The University of Oregon has a new initiative called Sustainable Cities, in which they create sort of this cluster effect that looks as though a number of people know about it, where they reach out to mayors and local communities throughout the state of Oregon, find a major problem, and then organize faculty, students, and a series of courses all around that challenge, and basically descend and swarm on that issue and help the locality turn it around. The crime lab at the University of Chicago has really gotten quite good at taking randomized controlled trials and making them affordable and responsive within a year as opposed to 3 or 4 years. At NYU, we've been doing a pretty good job of both being responsive and publishing scholarly articles in areas like housing and transportation and education. But the challenge that I see is that it still often operates outside the traditional boundaries of the public sector and institutions of higher learning. and that there's still a need for a framework and a definition for this work. And I was thinking of a similar conversation yesterday when Sandy Archibald talked about institutional design. And so I'm starting to, and that's what I hope we get to today, is almost, the word I'm thinking of is a compact. So some folks might know that in different regions in the country over the last 20 years or so, some universities that make an overt commitment to public K-12 education formed a higher education compact, which means that there's mutual understanding between the civic sector and the university sector as to what those terms of engagement are, and mutual accountability. And one recent example that I would give that's encouraging in this respect is at NYU, we recently created something 2 years ago called the Center for Urban Science and Progress. Essentially, it's a standalone school dedicated to big data. So this is a new degree granting institution focused on data analytics and helping cities. But when we created the school, it was created, one, obviously we built out the curriculum and hired faculty, but simultaneously we signed a series of MOUs with local government. So there's a real ease of communication and project work and what you might consider lab work that a lot of people talk about happens seamlessly now between the university and the city. And so one great example, I'm thinking of the camera pointed at me, is that at the Center for Urban Science and Progress, we have this great project that we just started on video analytics, in which we're working with the city parks department, and we set up a video to just see how many people are using school children and others' playgrounds throughout the whole city, so that we can better work with Mayor de Blasio, who wants to have better equity and allocation of resources in parks throughout the 5 boroughs, really understand how to make those decisions based on data. So I think what's interesting again about that model is that that connection, that institutional design was baked in at the very beginning. One other encouraging example is that NYU Wagner is part of a consortium that just received a $10 million award from the White House, specifically to work with distressed cities around the country. And so we were brought in as one of the 5 partners, which was very exciting. And then we said contingent on our participation is building higher education into the model of working with cities around the country. So the first set, 2 of the first cities we're working in are Linwood and Compton, 2 distressed cities in LA County, right outside of Los Angeles. And so we're working with Dean Jack Knott at the University of Southern California to better understand those issues in California and to reflect them out from a policy perspective. So again, I think that you're starting to see a lot more interest and activity, and the challenge that I'm focused on is how do we really frame this and make it
Okay, good. Well, I'm glad that Carolyn talked about that, because there are lots of important stories like that that are gratifying to hear. I think the question is, to what extent do they flow with the tide or against the tide? And I think there's heroic and energized individuals and a lot of institutional adaptation. I think the question is, how can we encourage that? And I fear that in some sense it's discouraged. So I think we really have in some ways the best of times and the worst of times in terms of this whole area of collaboration, in the sense the demand is higher for analytic expertise, I think, in government and around government than there ever has been. And we've seen the consequences of policy mistakes. Leaders get that. And I think there's a lot more investment being made in evidence-based policy, et cetera, et cetera. So there's great opportunities here, and I think it also, the opportunities increase because a lot of that expertise comes cloaked in partisan agendas, and so we are kind of usually free of that. But as we've talked about before, compared to where we were birthed as a field, we were birthed by great academics, in and outers, people like Merriam and Gulick and Richard Neustadt. As I Shelley Metzenbaum said, Richard Neustadt would have trouble getting tenure now, and because he wasn't doing the kind of quantitative work and that'll get published in JPART and now PART. So I mean, that's kind of the challenge. How do we kind of restore those boundary setters as kind of leaders, as champions? How do we celebrate that? Rather, we all have some people like that, but in some ways it might have been a mistake. It might have been an idiosyncratic feature in someone who's strongly swimming against the tide. And so I think that's really the question, and I'll leave it to David to talk more about the institutional factors that discourage this in the academy. I will just talk a little bit about one institution, NASPAA. and I used to head ASPA, and I had the same problem, bringing practitioners and academics with the rationale for our existence. And now, leading practitioners, leading academics don't think it's a waste of time to be in the same room with each other. They'd rather congregate amongst themselves. This conference ought to be a preeminent place to bring employers, policy people together with leading academics like ourselves. And yet, you see one public sector leader, except for our plenary speakers, working with us, talking with us, and engaging in sessions. I've said this to Laurel many times. I can say the same thing really about many organizations here. We've increasingly become specialized and isolated and insulated. And I would offer one case study. We had one exemplary practitioner, Danny Werfel, who approached me and Don Kettle and several others, and Laurel, about creating some institution to provide more access to academic expertise for federal policy wicked problems. And remember, we created a federal cafe and whatnot, and I think that needs to be evaluated. I'm not sure that anybody has. If anybody knows about that, I'd love to see it, but it's low-hanging fruit, and it would be very telling as kind of a marker about where we are institutionally. In my sense, there's a lot of practitioner problems. A lot of agencies didn't want to open up the vault and didn't want to expose themselves to these kinds of academic inquiries and the like. Danny was kind of a lone warrior in that sense. He's moved on, of course. But I think that is kind of a tale of sorts. Meanwhile, while we are kind of talking about this stuff and I think not moving out smartly compared to the demand, the world is moving smartly to fill the demand. And there's a whole host of expert institutions and think tanks and the like, other disciplines which fill this void. When the financial world went belly up in the 1930s, our people were there at the elbow of the New Deal, kind of creating institutions like the SEC and the like. These days, when we designed TARP, none of our people were called for that. It's largely called the people who are responsible for the problem. The experts who kind of could unravel it and try to fix it. And I fear that we're nowhere near these things. Ann Kadamian did a nice piece in PAR that kind of retrospectively looked at our field in the financial crisis. What can we learn? People like Tom Stanton. Most of us don't do that, and we've become stovepiped ourselves. I'm reminded of, and when you look at federal agencies, they're kind of awash in data and expertise. Much of it is procured through kind of the consulting firms with something that Sheldon Edner knows a lot about, IDIQs, which are kind of broad-scale contracts, which occasionally we get the crumbs off of as subcontractors. But meanwhile, Korea, if you look through the form to the substance, has a whole range of policy institutes that are kind of academically anchored that effectively are IDIQs with government. They have privileged relationships with government, where academics are kind of regularly involved and engaged in solving policy problems. So that kind of easy access and exchange is not really available to us as a routine matter, as an institutional matter. So it does happen, but it's the kind of thing that is very difficult to do. So we can talk some more later about some of the possible solutions. I think some of it has to do with the kind of people we hire. I say this going back Monday to do a promotion, a hiring review, and hear some candidates. And I mean, one of the first things I'm going to look at, because I'm in this rat race like everybody else, is how many journal articles did they do a J-part in PAR? Was it self-authored? Where do they stand in the list of the authors? I mean, that's the primary thing. If they've done a World Bank report or they have some interesting achievements in the nonprofit sector, well, more power to them. And thank God for my grandchildren. But frankly, when I'm looking to hire someone and I have 100 people to choose from, I'm going to pick the ones, and how many of you also get in this, right? I mean, this is kind of the race that we're in. And I think the fact that we have a one-size-fits-all, me included, lens on this, and the fact that we don't differentiate our hiring needs by the different kinds of skills that we want is part of the problem, at least.
Angela?
Well, I'm so glad everybody's here. Welcome. I'm going to take it from a different angle. I'm going to take it from a practitioner, as people would say, because that's how I was raised. I was in the Congressional Research Service for 43 years. I started as an analyst when people didn't know what policy analyst really was, and I moved all the way through that to be the deputy director. So what I want to talk about is I have a unique history because the Congressional Research Service was actually steeped in the relationship between the academic community and the legislative community. In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin experiment back in the progressive era, you had the legislatures in Wisconsin saying, you know, we keep getting bombarded with lots of different information. It all has like an angle. Where do we go to get some neutral, competence, objective, whatever word you want to need? And it was the academic community. Let's go to the University of Wisconsin. Let's go and look at professors who are teaching. So that movement, that Wisconsin movement, was live and well in Wisconsin, then was adopted by about 33 other states. Well, Mr. LaFollette, who was one of the founders of this movement, got elected to the United States Congress. He hadn't been elected, I don't know if he got the CRS, maybe not. He got elected and said, wait a minute, we don't have that at the U.S. congressional level. We can't go. Where's the neutral competence here? Where's the objectivity? So back in 1914, right after World War I, they started thinking about how do you take the knowledge of academia and bring it to the United States Congress at the national level. So at that point, what they did is they hired experts, and they hired these, they called them senior specialists. They were scholars in big areas like environment, even back then, income maintenance programs. There were 7 or 8 of them, and they worked with librarians to actually look at information and data, and this morphed. So in 1970, and it's interesting because we're talking like right around war times, like 1914, right after the Watergate and Vietnam, the Congress said, we need our own expertise that's analytical. And it has to be objective, it has to be nonpartisan, and it has to work on our timetable. So they took what was then the Legislative Reference Service, they made it the Congressional Research Service, and they said, we want policy analysts. We don't want academics necessarily, and we don't want people who are in the implementation stage. What we want is translators. We want people who are very acute at what they're seeing in the research in terms of what the assumptions are, the limitations are, and we want them to synthesize that and give us the best ideas they can in terms of, can we determine what the root problem is of these issues? And back then, you have to remember it's a different time because it wasn't evaluating programs that already exist, it was creating new programs. So it wasn't really so much about program evaluation, it was about how do we take care of some of these problems where we didn't have federal policies, no programs at that time. And they created CRS, and off we went to the races. What happened in that years between like 1970 and maybe 1990 or so was a development of this expertise. And maybe it's rarefied, I don't think, and I think it could be duplicated, but what happens there is analysts, their role as analysts is to make sure they're networked, and they're networked not just in academia, they're networked in the implementation, state, local, federal implementation. What is going on in the universe around this issue? How do we take what's going on and then how do we help Congress actually define what they're going to do? Because sometimes these problems are not easy and they're not parsable into these small little, neat little problem statements. They're complex. So for an analyst today at the Congressional Research Service, and this is what I think we need to think about in terms of what we grow in terms of our academic outreach and what we grow in terms of our students, are people who are very good at networking, are very good at assessing scholarship, understanding theory, know where there's assumptions, where there's strengths and weaknesses in data. But then, this is where we're talking about all these people who are making a difference, are creative and innovative in terms of how do you solve or attack, mitigate these problems, or exploit some challenges. So when people were at the table in the 1970s, 80s, when these policies were actually being developed, members of Congress weren't just saying, I just want a scholar, I just want an academic. I want anybody who knows anything, whether it's anecdotal, whether it's scholarly or whatever, and sit and think with me. I don't care about your latest research. You tell me what's up here from all the memory you have of your research. You tell me what's up here from all of what you've done in terms of implementation, and let's see if we can come up with some viable options, okay? This is what I think we need to be doing. And I think the public policy schools, the public affairs schools, that should be the hub of where we're doing these types of things. Once you have these ideas, then of course, these are then looked at in a political realm. But that's the person who's elected makes the decision about which option he or she is going to take. Our job is to make sure it's an informed decision. whatever they decide, they decide. So for me, I think this is what I see, and I think about this a lot and say, maybe just because that's how you grew up, you know, it's sort of your roots, and so I don't wanna like take it on everybody, but I fundamentally, objectively think that this is something we should think about in terms of how we move ourselves from being very grounded in scholarly research and not moving it into the policymaking community that really needs the benefit of the collective thinking here to solve some problems.
So let's, I guess, shift to kind of institutional issues and David.
Pleasure. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here on a joint NASPAA APPAM panel. To that end, I'm wearing both of my badges today. Farah, Laurel, we love you both. Paul had suggested that I could say all of the discouraging things that deans typically are charged with saying, and I'll do some of that, but I also wanted to bounce off of the notion that this is the best of times and the worst of times. When we open with the exciting examples that David and that Carolyn have given us of successful efforts to address real policy problems and real policy makers on the ground through institutional collaboration, we see that this is possible. We've heard numerous examples. I'm sure everyone in the audience has other examples to adduce. I'm going to give you yet more. So it seems to me that the problem is not that we are incapable of doing this. The problem is that we are not able in a systematic way to support it as a key value proposition that our institutions provide to all of the people who hire our students, finance our programs, pass the tax levy resolutions that fund our public institutions, and the laws that shape the conditions under which our nonprofit organizations, and I'm thinking of universities here, survive. And that's probably due to a certain extent to our collective disengagement from the persuasive process of shaping an image of what it is that the university does. Take, for example, the case that Angela just made for translation research. That's a very hot term in Europe and in healthcare research generally, not so common in the United States, but something that we need to be thinking about if what we're going to do is offer the value proposition that we're going to educate people and perform research, and that will make a difference in your ability to manage, to lead, to innovate in the government, nonprofit, and broadly public sectors that we face. That is an identity issue for us, and let me submit that it may become an existential issue for us if we allow our scholarship to move in directions that become indistinguishable from the scholarship performed in departments of political science, in departments of sociology, and other precincts in the academy. So let me, with that overview, go to the discouraging part, and then I want to talk about the encouraging part. You know the pressures that program directors, deans, and indeed individual faculty members have to face. We are all driven to a certain extent by rankings, and rankings don't value, by and large, the kinds of things that we're talking about. And folks, this is going to get worse before it gets better. The Shanghai Jiaotong rankings have become enormously popular, and even much more so outside of the US than inside the US. There is nothing in those rankings that respects in any way a contribution to a locality, a contribution to a federal policy effort. It is all straightforward grant research, heavily tilted towards STEM disciplines, and it's not going to help us do any of the things that we're talking about on this panel in any way. And I suggest to the extent that we're becoming more globalized, that ranking in particular and others like it will become larger questions on the minds of boards of trustees and of senior administrators. Which brings me to boards of trustees and senior administrators. It is, you know, we have, that's a constituency we have to please, right? And if we can't provide a community-endorsed countervailing assessment of where it is that we add value, we have nothing to say, because they are all interested in the same rankings games that we are, albeit at a broader campus level. So if we can't participate in some meaningful way to stoking those metrics, we're not going to be popular people on campus. There are a couple of bright lights in the horizon, and I'm going to mention those later, but I prefer to be depressing for the next couple of minutes. If you think about where scholars are rewarded, and I don't need to spend a whole lot of time here, there's not much that they get out of the good work that they might do in collaboration with institutions. I think that is susceptible to certain considerate remedies, but if it's just by itself a standalone, non-published, non-peer refereed made contribution that is highly unlikely, with certain very rare exceptions, to get the kind of traction that's ultimately going to propel you toward tenure and otherwise, and it's not going to help you with international reputation. And finally, in a broader institutional sense, even if you had a dean who really cares about this stuff, imagine, even if you were able to think about a range of projects that people could serve in this way, we hire people who are not selected for their ability to collaborate, who are not selected for their persistence on this kind of issue, on other kinds of issues for sure, but not for this kind of collaborative and very chancy and often stop and start kind of a project. So lots of difficulties. On the other side of the fence, we have a huge strategy gap. I would argue, even when you see all of these wonderful examples of places where universities have done good work on behalf of public entities and of nonprofit entities, there isn't a systematic sense that we're a go-to place. Part of it is all the problems that I just suggested that's on our side of the fence, but part of it too is that government hasn't done a very good job of figuring out how to reach out to the academy. You know, as Neil well knows, here in New York City, despite many collaborations, I'm going to mention a different one in a few minutes, there is literally no office of higher education affairs in the largest city in the United States. You know, if you wanted to have a project like this and you want to pitch it to government, and you could always go to the commissioner in a particular area, but university relations, nothing, squat. I would love to be in Milan. There are lots of good reasons to love to be in Milan. But in Milan, their economic development ministry is the Ministry for Economic Development and University Relations. And there is a very keen understanding that the university infrastructure in that city feeds the prospects of economic development. And it gets into that tether that Neil mentioned that is missing in most of our local, state, and federal conversations about university environments. So what can campuses do? Because what I've described is a landscape that is profoundly hostile to this kind of activity in any terms of any of the rewards that matter to universities. I think it really starts, and Carolyn provides an excellent example of this, of nurturing institutional partnerships. Because these partnerships pay all kinds of benefits, which can be research benefits. What I try to do when I work with my faculty is to provide them with a number of avenues to do research that can have immediate value to organizations, but that also provide pathways to research. And I don't need to elaborate on what Carolyn said. We don't need to make this choice. There is some additional bandwidth and hence opportunity cost that gets consumed when you're doing all of the institutional coordination and collaboration. But if you can offload some of that to administration, this is my goal, right? I mean, my office will do the relationship work. The faculty members can focus on the research and sometimes the educational components that come along as a result of the research. And there's still bandwidth and opportunity cost issues for them to address, but I can take the lion's share of it onto administration. And then as a school, we're actually participating. Just two examples. There's a project that we have in the field right now that began as a request inbound from the UJAF, who said, we are really concerned about the status of our city contracts. We think that they're not compensating our member nonprofits. This is the United Jewish Appeal Federation. They're not compensating our profits well enough to do the work that they're asked to do in the social, all of these are social service sector grants. So we agreed to do that work with UJAF if they allowed us to craft a relationship with the city to get all the contract information and allowed us to put that material together in a way that would be publishable, even if we de-identified institutions but otherwise published it. That produced publishable and published research. It also predicated an NSF application, which was funded and is working right now. We're building a database of contracts statewide and citywide across the United States, and it has now become a separate section of ARNOVA and an ARNOVA project that stems across the USA. You increase the potential for scholars across the country, you increase the ability of government to see what it's doing to NPOs that serve its social services needs, and you increase the value that's provided to the NPOs who began this project in the first place. Back to Carolyn's point, you don't always need to choose. We're involved in a project with the City Council of New York right now. New York City probably has the best and deepest research capacity on the executive side of any locality in the United States, not so with the council, where it's the person who's the chief of staff to 3 committees and 1 member who's desperately trying to keep up on recent legislation. So we've got a grant from them to do evaluation of 2 of the now 17 citywide projects that the council has initiated. And we're very excited about this work. But they had the idea when they started out with this that they were going to be able to do this under a model called results-based accountability. Now, I hope I'm not goring anybody's ox in saying this about RBA, but it's a wonderful way to have a community discussion about what you expect from policy. It is a miserable way to try to think about doing a hard-nosed policy analysis and outcomes assessment of the sort that most of us in this room would recognize. But this is what the council decided it wanted to do. We couldn't do RBA and still respect ourselves in the morning. But we could use the language, right? We could show them how they could build out a more robust assessment of impact based upon somewhat different ideas of how to proceed. And we met them halfway in moving this project forward. So the humility is important here. We've got to be able to translate, and in this case, translate in terms of language that they have already embraced. I could go over other examples, but I just want the two takeaways from this case being offload the burden from faculty to administration, understand this as a role of administration, and multiply the opportunities for these multiple impact things. Last points I want to make. We really have to move the needle in terms of the broad national and international environments that we address. That's because people have to understand reward differently and in a more plural sense than we are moving. We're moving just headlong in the other direction with the SJTU rankings and others. It's got to be different. So if we think about launching trifecta awards, what if our organizations had an award not just for the best scholarship, but for the best scholarly product that produced an actionable policy plan that was in fact adopted, okay? That would create incentives among our membership to begin thinking about doing those things. We have to promote the work that we do here, exactly in response to the Washington Post broadside that David mentioned, and many others like it, right? I mean, we've seen lots of this stuff over the last decade, and a lot of it is not wrong. We have to be able to provide articulate responses that say not, hey, we're the academy, we're above critique. It's here's how we actually do these things and how we're working to do it better. And final point, City University of New York is part of a 12-nation consortium called the WC2. I won't go into that in depth today. But the principal animating feature of it is how do public universities located in global cities help those cities succeed? How do the cities help the universities succeed? And how do we improve the prospects for both in network with one another? And one of the most exciting examples that I am aware of, not different in kind particularly, but somewhat different in circumstance, to some of the examples you've heard here, is called the Gauteng Ring City Region Observatory. And it's based at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, although Johannesburg U also has a piece of this. Direct funding from the government, direct funding from both universities with full release for 4 faculty members, and some of the most exciting research in a policy-relevant research desert that you have ever seen. And it is being used, it is changing the face literally. It has become the principal planning engine for the city of Johannesburg, and it provides a wonderful model, not grown at home, for how we can do this really well. I'm confident we can.
Jean, want to fix the broad view?
Absolutely. So much rich discussion here. Well, I think that what we're seeing here is a lot of challenges, both at the institutional, the interinstitutional, international, national level. But some of the work that Angela and I have been doing, and been supported by the National Science Foundation, is trying to think about kind of the reasons why we have pockets of success, but not the wider. Why are we still elevating great success instead of all of us able to accomplish that? And I think sort of the punchline of what I'd like to talk about is that the current systems are too entrenched. There are a lot of disincentives, and I'm going to be a little bit of a harbinger of bad news as well, since that was some sort of evidence coming out of some work we're doing. But so the onus is really on sort of the individual researchers and being able to help prepare them to break through some of these structural and operational barriers. While larger entities such as national associations, national science foundations, et cetera, are able to change at this, at the broader level. So where I wanted to go was to think a little bit about some of the reasons why people get stuck. And in September of 2013, we convened a workshop in Austin, Texas, or at the University of Texas at Austin LBJ School, and it was entitled Catalyzing Discovery for Social Impact. It was exploring the power of the research academic policy nexus to stimulate policy innovation. right in this area. We brought together a group of academic leaders, faculty, deans, and National Association representatives, researchers, and policymakers to try to really improve the understanding of how you move innovative social science research translated across to the policy sector through these kinds of partnerships. So we worked with 4 case exemplars that were sort of outliers that are having the successes, and worked as a group of about 27 people to unpack that and then build off of knowledge from multiple insights here from across the country as to what were some of the incentives and disincentives that were inherent. And what we came up with was some interesting findings in terms of why these, and I won't go into the details of the cases because we're short on time, but what we found was that the institutions that were involved, so these 4 successes, the institutions they were embedded in, and the leaders of those institutions, there was an openness to risk-taking on these new initiatives, and they were consistently and explicitly supporting these types of collaborations. And again, often this was in a lot of organizations, as we unpacked this, people talked about that being a real barrier. And again, now going back to the tenure track system and other incentives related to career process, and also just high levels of commitment. But there was also discussion of the ability to work off of pre-existing networks, initiatives, and formal structures, which we've heard about today, and also the need to focus on long-term relationship building. But once again, there's many disincentives built into the tenure track process and the publication process. And one of the really interesting insights that came out was thinking about the fact that in the process of earning tenure, people develop very strong work habits that would be antithetical to possibly spending time out in communities and researching. And once you're on the journal process, right, very difficult to back up. And again, obviously the things that have been talked about, like the lack of credit that's given to any of these types of collaborations. So for a multitude of reasons, there isn't the ability and the timing to build these long-term relationships unless it's being done on your own time or without any sorts of compensation. I think I'm not going to go into all the details because I know we're short on time. But what's important is that we need to think about So anyway, guess what I was going to say is that so there's a couple of ways that we can address this that we come up with at this workshop. One of those was to establish research agenda to really understand these sectors and how people are actually processing, working together. Won't go into that, as well as building the networks that have been discussed here, but also to really begin to unpack the incentive structures themselves. And again, that has to happen interinstitutionally and larger levels. But in the meantime, what we can do is to be able to really work on these individual, sort of what we call catalytic qualities of the individual researchers and how they can work to surmount these barriers. And so we thought about, and lots of people are talking about doing this at the departmental level to build curriculum, but what was really been building over the last year and with the support of the National Science Foundation is thinking about national curriculum models and how we can actually begin to identify and then build the curriculums to build those sorts of skills such as the collaborative leadership, the relationship building, value alignment, facilitation, working with cross-sectoral stakeholder groups, boundary spanning leadership, many of these kind of soft skills, but that would actually prepare people to be able to work to make these connections even with the disincentives as they are. So we just wanted to put a plug in that we are actually going to have a workshop in February of 2014 where, again, National Science Foundation is very committed to building these kinds of curriculums and thinking about kind of the basic elements of how to get around that, and as we get around collaboration, building and sustaining trusting relationships, shared values, and you hear all this as people are talking about their partnership, and again, being really clear on the policy environment itself and how to assess both the relevant policymakers and the stakeholder communities to build those kinds of bridges and how to do it over the long term.
Fantastic. So I think what's so exciting about what Jenny just said is the fact that the National Science Foundation is interested in putting money into this and interested in maybe supporting us to build curriculum around this to really capitalize the fee. I also think even though we were set out to talk about challenges, huge amount of solutions I talked about, and I just want to recap that and then open it up to you. So I heard we have to have better, and we're already starting to do it, projects that lead to pathways to research. We need to focus on translation. We need to take an organization like NASPAA, I would also say APPAM, and as Paul was saying, find the right intermediary so that we can better convene in real time policymakers and academics. As I was mentioning, I think we need something along the lines of a compact for mutual understanding and engagement. CUSP at NYU is one example of building a school and a new program with MOUs with local government at the outset. And David had a great point in terms of really offloading responsibility for this from faculty and individual projects back onto administration. And I also love the idea of having an award that would reward both research and scholarship, but also impact. So with that, I want to open it up to everyone else. Again, we don't have to just focus on the solutions. We can continue on challenges, but I hope that we can mix both in as we go forward. But yes.
Let me make 3 quick points as I can as a former and now recovering dean who actually tried to encourage faculty to do this kind of stuff. And, but 3 points that are more in the glasses half full side. The first is that it's important to recognize that not everybody has to do this kind of engagement. Some people are not good at it, and most state relations officials, as most universities, have a list of faculty members that never want to get anywhere near a state legislature. But there's some people who are very good at it, and so the key is to differentiate. It's important as we try to craft this problem that we don't make it into a problem that every single faculty member has to solve. It's something that institutionally every school, every university has to solve, but not every faculty member has to be involved in doing it. The same way that we don't want to have to insist that every faculty member practices a certain kind of regression. The second thing is that this is activity that probably fits some stages of the career better than others. If you want to be really careful about mentoring junior faculty, about investing huge amounts of time spending in the community because it can undermine their path toward tenure. It's the kind of activity that's safer for people to do once they have more security. And so it's a matter of trying to figure out the stages of that. The third, and maybe in my mind one of the most important things, is that some of the constraints that are placed on this kind of activity are self-imposed and can be changed. I don't know anything that most university-level tenure committees do that insist that to be able to get tenure, somebody's got to have 15 articles in JPARC. That the standards that university committees enforce are set largely by the schools themselves. There's an expectation of excellence, but how scholars meet those is something that individual school-level decisions can shape in terms of the decisions and the standards that are set for tenure. And it's possible, not easy, but possible to negotiate tenure standards that incorporate explicitly contribution to this kind of research and to reward that in the process for tenure. And we've been successful at Maryland in getting people tenured who have research, but balance that by productivity that's matched in part by the kinds of engagement that they have with the public sector. There's the usual teaching and research and service, and the skillful crafting of the service component of the tenure standards can make it possible to acknowledge and reward that, and then to educate higher level university officials on it. Not easy, but certainly possible, and we have to be careful that we don't self-inflict some of the wounds we're trying to solve.
I had a point on what John just said. I mean, another thing, I think what you just mentioned about the stage of career is really important. I mean, we should not get so hung up on this idea of people aren't going to get tenure, because if you think an average academic has 20 to 30 years in their career, maybe 30 years, and 10 years around up to 10 years around 6 years or so, or maybe 20 to 25% of their time in their career, that gives you a lot of time to engagement. In fact, I felt like I learned a lot from the senior scholars that I worked with when I was a young scholar myself that gave me some of those tools for a time. I was lucky to be at a place like Wisconsin where there was this tradition there. We had lots of mechanisms by which we did it at Wisconsin. So I learned that. And so I think we should not get so hung up like, well, you know, and I agree, junior scholars, we have to protect them in that. But you have a long career beyond tenure which to do these kinds of things.
And we have, within our power, greater flexibility in trying to help create reward systems that in fact we take advantage of. And we can do that more aggressively, even if it means we have to try to educate our provosts and university presidents in the process.
If I could just speak slightly to the contrary on what you just said about junior faculty. My experience is, if you tell your junior faculty, go to any university service, just write, then when they get tenure, they don't do any university service because they've had 7 years of a habit of not doing anything but.
I didn't mean that extreme.
Right, I know, no, I know you didn't. But I think you need to introduce them early to this idea of engagement, maybe with a protected senior faculty member taking most of the brunt of keeping the relationship going. But if you wait until they got tenure, you've lost them.
No, my point was you're in a learning curve in that period that allows you to take on and manage a big project like that.
Yeah, I agree. You can't do it all at the beginning.
Great points. Let's move to another one. Mark.
Well, I just was really, this is a great conversation. I mean, I'd like to talk to you all at great length about this, I won't. I would say several things, though. There is a demand, and you've all sort of mentioned that, but the public officials that I interact with need and want real, concrete, specific information that they can use to make a difference, because they're being evaluated sort of every day, and they need to produce. But the interesting thing is, I believe among your students, there is a tremendous demand for this relevance. We do this thing with the Fells Institute of Government called the National Institutional Public Policy Challenge, where we get teams from your schools, NYU has won it a couple of times, and we ask those kids to identify a public challenge, a problem in their community, a strategy for dealing with that, and a political strategy. You have to show that you've engaged policymakers, the mayor's staff, whoever, to get this done. They do dynamite work. It's really exciting. They want to do this stuff, and one of those projects is designed to change public policy in the city of Philadelphia, the city of New York, in the state of Georgia. The final thing that I would say is David has mentioned this idea of a city hall person whose job it is to interact with the university to make it through. And I just think it is a dynamite idea. And I think taking that Milan thing, that is like the model that I'm going to try to sell to some city administrators, because I think it's a great idea.
Great. More comments?
So when I think about the way in which public policy schools are situated on their home campuses, and the way in which you discussed about how you should do the academic mix, for those that are at land-grant universities in particular, there's this glaring exception that seems to thrive and completely succeed in doing what we were talking about, except in a very narrow domain. It's called the ag school. And nobody seems to criticize them on those home campuses in any way. In fact, they are almost completely externally organized. They basically don't do pure research. They do applied research, and they have cooperative extension built in. They have research scientists, they have external faculty, and they are completely evaluated by their ability to help the agricultural community, particularly in their local states. How can this be commensurate with the view that universities don't do this? And I would say that probably if we were to redesign the perfect policy school, we'd scrap the designs we have now. And maybe it's time to think about that conversation, because the ag schools have shown that it can thrive on, these are top-tier universities that have ag schools, and non-top tier universities as well. But they survive and they thrive. Why can't we? And why can't we follow that institutional design and build into our expectations on our home campuses and say, look, ag schools can do it, why can't we do it? What's so magical about them? They're working with cows and rice and wheat, and we're working with undereducated children, and people aren't getting health care. What is the difference here? Why can't we be legitimate doing this? And why can't we succeed and thrive?
Children don't have an organized ag lobby.
Correct, but the fact is that's only a small piece of it. I mean, the fact is the ag lobby is not as big as it used to be, but they're still out there doing it. When my wife was working at an ag school, I was just stunned, coming from a social science background, what was considered to be what the faculty were supposed to be doing. There were guys who were trying to grow chickens with longer legs. Wow. That's what you do? Yes, that's what I do. And people love me for it. Wow. I was never allowed to do anything even vaguely that applied and considered legitimate. And so we can look at that model as an institutional redesign and say, we could bite this bullet. And why not?
Well, I think Eric makes a good point, because sometimes, as you evolve and you will change little by little, and then you turn around, it's 40 years later, and it's really taken a very close look at what's happened to you over the last 40 years. So you don't see it each day or each year or each 5 years, but you morph. So in that metamorphosis, have we lost something, or have we, is our time come to really be strong enough or secure enough to say, no, we really do need to think through some of these things, and everybody has some great ideas. So we have data, we have experiences that show successes, so maybe it is time to see that we've got some different kinds of models to look at.
I think that illustrates the strength, the importance of networks
Yeah.
in very institutional ways. And I think that's what's withered, frankly, in recent years. I mean, ASPA used to be a network like that. We used to have practitioners, academics coming together. And that's, I think, what's really now we have two cultures, different Myers-Briggs scores. And it's, you know, even my analysts at GAO, would go up to the Hill and they would tell the chairman of the House Budget Committee about the dummy variable we used in a regression model, and the staff said, never talk about dummy variables. But it's just the fact that really ships passing in the night. So I agree with you, if you can get some institutional cover from your dean, who's enlightened enough to kind of do this, but I think it also has to start with the analysts kind of developing these, you know, one-on-one relationships.
Just real quickly on the university organization, there's a new Carnegie classification that gives me some hope, and that is publicly engaged university. So you can choose to be a publicly engaged university. It affects the way that you pursue regional accreditation and all the rest of it. There are now several universities, including one of our members, VCU, that advertises itself as both one of only 40 institutions that are both research intensive and publicly engaged in the Carnegie classification. We should be able to help all of our universities own that publicly engaged component and be the principal, at least one of the principal expressions of that modality of engagement. But there's something out there, and that's one of my small rays of hope.
I think I would caution a little bit about this characterization of you know, people within our agencies, you know, not wanting to hear anyone talk about something methodological specific or something like that, because I actually have found that I've engaged with people in agencies who are equally frustrated that some of their insights about how they should be doing things better don't get taken into consideration in policy. And they actually appreciate that we can bring to them rigorous methods. Not that they don't understand or don't value them, but they don't have time. They don't have the resources to apply them. I also think, I mean, I would, you know, there are definitely ways I could see it'd be helpful to have more support for what we're trying to do from the institution, you know, where I am. On the other hand, I also feel like you can't offload everything from the researcher and say, you just do this and we'll take yours, because part of our credibility with the people we work with in policy situations, because we are there, we're listening to them, we're understanding their perspective. I had this experience in Wisconsin where I was working with the Department of Health Services. They were contracted with a big, I won't name it, but everybody knows the name of this research organization that does a lot of work for the government. And they came and made a presentation to them, and they said, you know what? If they only would have talked to us, we could have told them all that finding was unusual, and there was some issue there. And so being on the ground, understanding the things, and then they have to, this is also very important, they have to have trust. I mean, some people I work with, their jobs are on the line depending on what we are finding. And how we handle that, so they have to believe that when we find this, we are very sensitive to how that's going to affect their position in this initiative, or how they interact with their school board in this case, or whether it's another thing. So, I mean, part of that, again, is, so there are ways institutions work, but researchers to really be engaged with that, we just can't stay in that free time.
And you know what, when you were describing your experiences, I kept thinking about, like, again, I don't want to say, you know, when the old days when I walked to school 16 miles, but I remember that when you were talking about some of the great society legislation, the domestic legislation, that was exactly how things were done. They would have people people in a room with legislatures, and they would say, okay, practitioners, they get hearings, they get scholars, everybody was working together, and everybody was equal at the table. So, but what can you offer? You can offer insight like, we tried that, it doesn't work. My insight is we've been doing this on a scholarly basis for so many years. This is what I see. You're a politician, this is what I can sell with. And so people were coming together in those kinds of environments. Different products were prepared for people so that they could be able to snuff. But that's exactly the kind of environment. And somehow, either we've made scholars or we've made people are afraid of it or something. I don't know. But that's exactly the environment.
So I want to make sure we still get any other contributions from the audience. Other thoughts to bring in. Sandy, how does this reflect from the conversation we had yesterday?
Well, I love it. I think it's just, there have been about 4 or 5 sessions that keep reaffirming, looking at our existential imperative that I think we have to do, because the rest of the world's catching up with this. We've been ahead of the social science applied research policy world for 30 or 40 years. And this is the next logical step. Look at the people who want to be with Paul now, who realize this is a really strong way to look at applied work, engaged work, taking theory to practice. So I think this is just lovely. But I want to just say one thing. How many faculty do we have in all of our 250 policy schools? We have, how many? 20 in each school, 30 in each school. Scaling this, it's really good work. We all have examples, but how do we make this have a really large impact? We do have a lot of students. Our students do 80,000 hours of internship work a year. Thinking about how that we could use that and shape that to have a bigger impact would tie us in as well with educating our students. But I just think this is very exciting.
That's a great thought. So we would love, so for example, I'm talking to a foundation while I'm here, but so a lot of work we do is externally funded, and a lot of agencies don't want to pay for this, you know, what we call it research and practice collaborative that we try to build. They don't want to pay for that part of it. They want to pay for the research. So we do have to get creative in how we find the resources. If the agencies or foundations, I mean, if the NSF and other foundations value that. I know, the WT Grant Foundation has their own initiative on using evidence, but there needs to be more of that investment. I've been talking with people in like U.S. Department of Labor, they want their people in the agencies to be able to engage with the researchers, to take some of their ideas, to help them test them. So that's why I would love to see more funding. I could think of a million different ways we could apply it and train our students. I mean, we trained our students on projects. The students see the value of this. They take that on, but there've got to be more resources. And universities, we just, we're getting cut. It's not something we can generate ourselves.
I think we have to be innovative, and I think we have to go beyond the traditional ways of trying to get it.
Yep.
I think one way to think about this, and Don's point is right, this is not one size fits all, but it's, some of this is absolutely essential to produce valid data and analytics. In the field of federal budgeting, for example, nobody gets in there and does the essential work to explore the plumbing of budgeting. What they do is they rely on these data sets, which are artifacts of budgeting, like PART, which is long outlived its usefulness. So article I get for peer review on PART, which I just really frankly say enough with this shadow boxing. This is an artifact of the data that we have, but nobody's made the investment to engage with people in the trenches and understand how budgeting is really done and the influences of various factors. And I think you have to build trust relationships, you have to do good qualitative analysis, and nobody's doing it. And so I think this is kind of a window into understanding, in a deeper level, the kinds of phenomena we're trying to understand analytically.
Well, that ties also to Eric's point, but we used to have these urban programs that were developed in the 60s and early 70s that have disappeared. Many of them are gone. In fact, UT Arlington, theirs has been merged in with architecture. So one of the last ones is still going through this evolution. And I think it's because the networks have evaporated. And again, this is part and parcel of that disengagement, because we've created incentives to which we are responding, which have divorced us from that engagement with the public and melted down the very healthy networks that we had once upon a time. federal, state, and local. But certainly at the urban level, we actually had the ag model was the model that we built those programs on. And where are they today?
I bet you have a lot more than you think. We're going to do crowdsourcing of our 3,500 alums, and we're going to find out where they are, what they're doing, and what those networks look like. And we could spend some time at NASPAA thinking about the same thing. I think we have a lot more political networks out there than we know.
So I want to use Sandy's comment to frame us up for the last 7 or 8 minutes that we have together. So one of the things, I'm really excited that NASPAA next year is in New York, our hometown, so we hope you're all there. Also, we of course will have another APPAM. I'm wondering what we can do between now and next year, and almost sort of set a deadline for ourselves. So Sandy just made an overture. I really, as Carolyn's on the way out, I'm going to reference her comment, which is a good one, which is that as some of these networks have begun to crumble, or different centers that have played this role where cities have been integrated and consolidated, there's money out there. So there are federal agencies, there are a number of private foundations that I work with, we receive funds that are interested, but I don't think that we're as coordinated and clear about what we need going forward. So one recommendation I would make is maybe the next time we have a panel like this, a year from now, to have some kind of framing document to react to that might articulate principles, obstacles, ways that we can better use resources, so that if we're better coordinated, we might be able to advance the work that we would like to do with a number of grant makers, public and private, that are interested in seeing more of this activity. So I'd like to ask maybe rapid fire, other things we might want to accomplish between now and the next time we all come back together. Panelists, David.
One quick one, I mentioned it earlier. Many people think that on Tuesday we saw a lesson in the ill wisdom of running away from your record. And if we could find ways coherently to celebrate and talk about the things that we have done well and that we have talked about today, and own them, rather than talking about what it is we tuck under our published research, we'd be better off. So that'd be a great thing to do before next week.
Great.
I'd like to, actually Shelley mentioned about what you just left, but the idea of having an evaluation of the Fed Cafe, what happened, why did it happen, and what lessons can we learn about institutionalizing a linkage between the federal government, as we've talked about in cities, federal government, and university research.
And one thing we're working on is trying to collect cases, and as part of our initiative is to find exemplars and use them in the curriculum to actually help build people's understanding of how this.
I want to tell you a little time. This NSF is an outgrowth of efforts that they made in the physical and hard sciences and the medical sciences, where NSF said, let's look at how these discoveries that are taking place in the hard sciences, how they're moving into social entrepreneurship, how we're moving them into actually making societal benefit. And so we thought is that that's helpful in the policy. Of course, we have different sets of people. But one of the things I think NSF is we're working with them on, they're working on a lot of different things. Ours is one of the hard courses. So you start with the research, so you're getting the grants, and you're saying to them, you got to think about, we're giving you this grant, you got to think about how this grant money is going to be implemented. How is your research going to make a difference in the policy making? So we're thinking about how do you train, or how do you sensitize, or how do you make people who are principal investigators more comfortable with this type of thing? So it's a slice of this group, but it's still people who are getting these grants. So and the NSF initiative in I-Corps has really been adopted by a lot of different agencies and movements all over the world. So I think we should keep an eye on this for the next time, just to see what we can report back and how much progress we made, and we can actually get down to how we can expose people to just thinking a little differently about the research before the research is actually totally done. So that's another thing I'd like to put out there.
Great. All right. We've got a lot done.
Yeah.
And we have homework.
Yeah.
So thank you all for coming, and David, it's so good to work together.